Hello, everyone, and welcome to Spirit of Truth Church for this talk on critical theory, where we're going to take a look at the central tenets of critical race theory and all types of critical theory. So let's go ahead and get started by talking about its origins and development. So, first off, critical theory was developed to attempt to take a look at the ways in which people perceived that race, racism, racial power, white supremacy were constructed, and especially in the legal culture. So what this means is this started out essentially as a legal theory. Okay? So people were attempting to say, is there any way we can utilize laws to try to rectify what they perceived as racism inherent in the system? Now, it's important to understand that the way that we traditionally do law is by assuming, or at least taking as an axiom, that there are self-evident universal moral principles. Things like it's wrong to murder, it's wrong to steal, it's wrong to riot, it's wrong to destroy property, public property or private property. Right? All of these things that we would assume are self-evident. In other words, if you failed at these things, if people simply allowed these things to go on, you'd run into the situation of society breaking down. Okay? Now, because there was a self-evident recognition then, it was argued that we are allowed to pass laws on these things. So, first off, I want to go ahead and mention this. A lot of people talk about passing a biblical morality or legislating a biblical morality. Well, for people who were initially concerned with writing laws, they saw biblical morality as self-evident as well. In other words, the things of the Bible were things which were self-evidently wrong. So it's important to kind of understand that they weren't just simply arbitrating according to Scripture. They believed that Scripture also dictated reality. And so when they arbitrated Scripture, they believed they were arbitrating something that was self-evident, a universal moral principle. But critical legal theory essentially stated that individual court justices and judges could be motivated by personal whim and also by social forces and social power. So this could look like the following. Say you find a minority person who is being brought up on charges of drug dealing. Okay? And then the judge would look at it and say, well, you're only drug dealing because you came from a poor area and because you had a bad home life. And so then the judge might say, you go free. In other words, they essentially make up justice according to what they see fit on the fly. Now, critical race theory is a bit of a departure from this in the sense that it's much more pragmatic. Critical legal theory is not going to argue take it to the streets and be an activist, but critical race theory is. Critical race theory wants to actually tear down the institutions of society, not just use legislation to help modify problems that may or may not be there. Okay, critical race theory believes that legal theory failed to recognize the racialized character of law. In other words, critical race theory is like, well, yeah, you might be making legislative things, you might be letting people off or giving people less sentences or freeing people from prison, but it's doing nothing about the laws themselves. And so essentially they view the law as a tool of white supremacy, as a tool to keep white people in power. Okay? They also argue that things like liberalism and colorblindness and civil rights are just more things to keep white supremacy in place, which is why they're so against those things. Now, we also have to understand that though critical race theory has some ties to the legal theory piece of it, it also has ties to the Frankfurt School and historic critical theory. And Gramsci is one of the big guys who kind of was fomenting these things, especially the more Marxist aspects of critical race theory. You also had Foucault and Derrida, as well as Chavez and Du Bois, MLK Jr., the Black Power movements, and the Chicano movements as well. And here's the other key piece about this. As critical race theory and as critical theory gains power, it really starts to dominate the educational journals and peer-reviewed scholarship. Now, why is this important? Because if it dominates the education sphere, then this is going to be the primary framework by which teachers teach the next generation. This is, I would argue, one of the reasons why this has become so entrenched in such a large portion of our society. It has nothing to do about any merits that it may have. It has nothing to do about whether it's right or wrong. It has everything to do with the fact that it was taught to very, very, very young, impressionable people, very moldable people. And in its instruction, it begins to become rigid and immovable against change and anything else. And so, essentially, you have that piece and you have the peer-reviewed scholarship, which means it's now infected academic literature. And with that means it's now infected all levels of education. So now it's going to be in all kinds of different degree programs, no matter what the program is, whether it's biology or chemistry or English or literature or sociology. It's going to have critical race theory in it. And so it's very entrenched in education. Delgado and Stefanik argued that CRT has spread rapidly in terms of geography, breadth, and audience. And the authors argued that it was essentially entrenched in public schools, K through 12, in some form or another. And we've seen this. We've seen this all throughout the country lately. And then I like this quote from page 151. Quote, "It should be blatantly obvious by now that anyone, no matter what they claim about their expertise, who asserts that CRT is just a legal theory confined to law schools, or who downplays its interdisciplinary presence, is either woefully ignorant or outright lying." See, this is the thing. People have tried to say that, oh, critical theory is it's just a minor thing. It doesn't get into the education system. It's not being taught anywhere. It might not be taught explicitly, but remember, you don't have to teach critical race theory in order to be an activist for critical race theory, or in order to instill the principles of critical race theory in an activist setting. You can do that without referencing Gramsci and Foucault and Derrida. You can just simply teach the reality as critical race theory sees it. Now, it also, and this is another reason why it's difficult to kind of pin down, it resists essentialism. So there's no true standard dogma or methodology for critical race theory. So I like what the authors tried to do here at this point. They basically said, well, we've come up with 15 main tenets of critical race theory scholarship. And so, and I mean, I've even had people talk to me and tell me, oh no, critical race theory is not bad and it's just misunderstood or it's just been misapplied by people. Not true. Not true at all. In fact, those types of comments, again, I think are either ignorant or they're so far afield of critical race theory that it's borderline useless. So let's go ahead and go through some of these tenets. First, quote, "Critical race theory contends that race as a concept is a social construct and not rooted in human nature or biology and was created for the express purpose of disenfranchising people of color, especially blacks." So that's an intriguing statement in and of itself. Because even in the way that this is phrased, the way that this would then be taught, it's as though white-black relations have dominated all of human history, which is simply not true. We haven't really seen a lot of this stuff until, again, some of the colonial era. But prior to that, you had the Roman Empire, you had Islamic empires, you had Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. I mean, you've had a number of different things that have been dominant at various points. Asia has essentially been what it is, isolated from the world for many thousands of years. And people understood race apart from simply, quote, people of color. In fact, again, people understood that people had different colors of skin and different cultures whenever they interacted with each other. This wasn't a concept that was created. Now, one thing that is important, though, is this, is in terms of it being a social construct. It is true that all humanity is humanity. Doesn't matter the color of skin, you're a human being. There is essentially one true race, right? The race of humanity. So the idea then that color can be associated to things like, for example, intelligence, or can be associated to, various types of things that actually has been racist throughout the years. Okay, that is a social thing. Okay, there's no doubt about that. So there is some sense in which, yes, race is social construct, but it was not created for the express purpose of disenfranchising people of color. That's where they really missed the boat on this, and they slant it completely wrong. The second tenet is that CRT claims racism is endemic, permanent, pervasive, and often hard to recognize. And this should automatically key you in that their definition of racism is not the same as our definition of racism. Our definition of racism would be treating someone different because of the color of their skin and treating them in a way that's negative, right? Typically associated with being negative or holding someone back. Their understanding of racism has nothing really to do with individuals' behavior toward each other. They're arguing that institutions themselves hold people of color and minority people in positions of destituteness or essentially low economic status or low education. And they're going to argue that things are set up against people of color or minorities, for example. Okay. Again, the problem here is that in terms of evidence for this, yes, there have been things done in the past. A lot of those things have been removed. If anything, the data show now that the breakdown of the family unit is one of the primary drivers of a negative culture. So if you ever have a culture in which family units have broken down, you're going to have pretty serious problems. Funny thing is, this is not just restricted to people of color or black people. This happens in white communities. This happens in Asian communities. It doesn't matter what community it is. When you have breakdown of family, when you have breakdown of traditional Judeo-Christian values, you're going to have a destructive civilization, essentially, or society. Number three. CRT contends that racism is much more than individual attitudes and actions. It is endemic to social institutions, sectors, and systems, and is best understood as white supremacy, broadly redefined and not restricted to the narrow definition tied to white power and white nationalist hate groups. So remember, in critical race theory, anyone who is white is basically a white supremacist, by definition. Again, it's broadly redefined. So when people say, oh, you're a white supremacist, and it's like, just because you exist, because you have a family, because you have children, because you're married, because you work hard. What they're really doing is they're vilifying the very things that society holds, that hold society together. Now, one might argue, or ask, I should say, why would they do that? What benefit would anyone have to vilify hard work? To vilify intelligence, critical thinking, to vilify objectivity. Well, this is where we have to get into a better discussion about what the point of this is. So we've seen in the first three tenets, critical race theory paint people of color, black people as victims. We've seen that the claim that there is a omnipresent, ever-existing, never-ending enemy and oppressor of the victim group. And we've seen that this oppressor group has been defined literally by the color of people's skin. And not only that, but this oppressor group is just gigantic. It's literally, 40%, 45% of the country. This isn't about race. This isn't about equality or even equity. There's only one reason why you do this. And that's power and control. You see, the people who actually develop these theories know what they're doing. They're very clear on what they're doing. They make a lot of money doing what they do. And they control things like you wouldn't believe. Because when you take a look at communist Marxist, essentially asserting one class over another, the point of that is revolution. The point of that is essentially saying, hey, we're going to cause an uprising. And when we cause that uprising, we're going to make sure we're the ones that take power. And so it seems as though CRT is essentially set up to cause such a rift in society that it causes an actual civil war during which CRT people can rise to power. And I think that's the point of this, because none of this lines up with reality. CRT rejects a colorblind society, claiming it provides cover for less overt forms of racism and serves to erase important racial and ethnic distinctions that should be emphasized. Again, in a colorblind society, like we were moving toward in the 90s, people were friends of people of all different backgrounds and ethnicities and skin colors. I remember this in my town. And yet, people are trying to push away from that. Well, why? Because when everybody sees everybody else is on the same team, they can't be controlled. They can't be pitted against each other. And so here CRT is attempting to pit people against each other. It's attempting to make Americans hate each other. CRT ultimately is a philosophy of hate. It's a philosophy that breeds animosity. It's a philosophy that breeds evil. When I interact with people in CRT and try and interact and have a reasonable conversation, there's a rejection of that right off the bat. People don't want to have a reasonable conversation because they object to reasonability and objectivity to begin with. So, number 5, CRT elevates and prioritizes Black voice, Black lived experience, and the indispensability and authority of Black experiential knowledge relative to the social analysis of law, in particular, and society in general. Within the notion of lived experience is the feature of storytelling, the presentation of narratives that counter white majoritarian experience. Now, this is really important to understand because what this is going to say, read instead of white majoritarian experience, read Judeo-Christian worldview. So, in other words, what they want is for other narratives, other meta-narratives, other stories to be told that counter the Judeo-Christian worldview and narrative. In other words, they want to challenge the Judeo-Christian worldview and narrative at every possible avenue. And so they want stories. They want all of these types of things, whether it be media, whether it be personal stories, whatever it is. But they want to saturate the environment so that all you hear now is anti-Christian, anti-Judeo-Christian worldview and stories. And they blanket that and say, oh, well, that's just giving everyone equal footing. Well, again, does everything deserve equal footing? If we truly believe the Bible, if we truly believe what Christianity says, it doesn't deserve equal footing. In fact, by giving evil narratives and evil stories time in our minds and time in our child's lives and things of that nature, what we're doing is we're teaching them that Christianity is only one option among many. That Christianity is no more right than anything else. And this actually brings me to a book that just came out that I'm looking forward to reading. I think it just came out very recently by Thomas Howe, I believe it is. Who, if I'm correct on the correct Thomas Howe that I'm thinking of, was it Thomas Howe? It was Howe, but I believe he's the and I know him actually if it's the one I'm thinking of. He is the Thomasonian Christian philosopher, and what's fascinating is he wrote a book on critiquing Christian critical realism. And what Christian critical realism essentially says is that, well, our theology is only as good as our tools and our means and our methods, and we basically have to constantly understand that our theology is never perfect and it's subject to change. And that sounds really good, and a lot of people have gone over to Christian realism saying, oh yeah, it's like our theology is subject to change. But here's my question. I get it on things, I get there's different levels of certainty we might have about pieces of theology. Okay? I understand. I think that's reasonable. But are we really going to say that the Trinity is up for debate at this point? Are we really going to say that the resurrection's up for debate? That new information could change it? Is that really where we're going with this? Do we not believe that Scripture has spoken clearly about these core things? And I think he's right. I think it's just a sly way of getting subjectivism into religion, into people's thinking. Because once you get subjectivism into people's thinking, they stop defending the truth because they can't say that it is the objective truth. And then all of a sudden they stop believing it. And so critical race theory is targeting that directly. Now, number 6, CRT recognizes interest convergence as a social reality, namely that Black interests will only be served to the extent that they serve white interests. Okay, so essentially what's going on here is that it's this ultra skepticism. Like, if ever things are done that benefit the Black communities, then that must be because they also serve the white community or white interests. And that's just simply not true. But that's, again, fomenting this divide. Okay. Number 7, CRT challenges ahistoricism and offers revisionist history by replacing white majoritarian interpretations of events with ones that fit more readily with Black and brown experience. Within the notion of revisionist history is another feature of storytelling. presentation of stories that counter white majoritarian history. So again, read here, for example, the 1619 Project, trying to literally revise all of our understanding of American history. But not only that, this goes into the Islamic issue, trying to essentially pacify all of Islamic history, making Islam about being the victim. Okay? All of these types of things, again, rewriting history. And it's not like they're not pulling on things that may have happened, but they're emphasizing them or presenting them in a way that's simply dishonest. And so we see that tactic all over with CRT. Number 8, CRT puts forth the notion of racial realism. The societal benefits map to a racial hierarchy in society where whites are situated at the top. Adjacent to this recognition is the notion of hegemony, the dominance of the power of whites over blacks, maintained not by force, but through the customs, ideas, norms, values, and traditions of whites, supported via tacit consent of blacks. The dominance of whites in society has compelled blacks to adopt a double consciousness, the two-ness tension faced by blacks to see themselves through whites, white perspectives, the white gaze, and to see themselves through their own individual black perspectives. So the issue here is this idea of hegemony. It's the idea that, oh, white people are always at the top. Okay? First of all, that's simply not true. You go to Africa, that's not true. You go to Asia, that's not true. You go to Latin America, not true. The problem here is that this is taking a very, very minimalist view. If anything, what we're seeing worldwide is an attack on white people and an attack on Judeo-Christian worldview. And the attack is sustained, heavy, and ongoing. In terms of number 9, CRT promotes the notion of intersectionality, the claim that different facets of our identity interact in distinct and complex ways based on a particular intersection of social categories we occupy, yielding a life and existence that can be generally characterized by either privilege, oppression, or both. In other words, if you're not a white heterosexual male, then all of a sudden you are at some disadvantage. And the more of these disadvantages you accrue, say you're a black, lesbian, maybe even transgender, somehow, you name it, all of those things, well, then you are more disadvantaged, and therefore you should have a bigger voice because those things interact in different ways. Okay, number 10. CRT critiques the system of meritocracy and argues that it often serves to reify the white supremacy and status quo. In other words, merit. You deserve what you get because you worked X hard and you accomplished X task. And they argue very much against that. The problem is when you start to argue against things like meritocracy, it does two things. One, it de-incentivizes people from doing a good job. It actually de-incentivizes any growth in the community that you're saying that to. Why in the world would a community that's not doing well economically work harder when everyone keeps telling them that working hard is evil? The problem is things don't just grow on trees. People have to work hard to make things. They have to work hard to build things. They have to work hard to generate jobs and generate money and generate wealth. But that's not how CRT sees it. So they're going to fight against the best of the best. It's funny, I read Atlas Shrugged, and I've often said this about Atlas Shrugged. When I read it, I said, man, if I weren't a Christian, I would absolutely be and I think she's objectivism, right? Something like that. It's called objectivism. I would be essentially an Atlas Rand supporter. I'd probably say she's got it the best. And it's funny, but because I'm a Christian, I actually think her philosophy and view is really, really bad. Like, it's really, really wrong in terms of her solutions. But she identified a worthwhile point in that anything other than capitalism simply won't work. Whether it's, essentially a form of aristocracy, or whether it's kleptocracy, or whether it's any of these other types of things, whether it's essentially corporations, basically just dominating everything and crushing out new entrepreneurs. Anything other than people owning their own means of labor and being able to benefit and profit off of it is going to end in a problematic situation. Why? Because once you're divorced from what you do, you lose your connection to your work. You lose the pride in your work. You start to lose what makes that work worth doing. And then actually you're told, don't innovate. Who's been in job situation like this? Don't innovate. Don't change things. Don't make things better. Keep it the same. Keep it the same. Keep it the same. And I mean, this has always been one of my issues with working at corporate positions was I just couldn't help myself. I had to make things better. Why? Because then I took pride in what I do. If I just sit there doing the same thing every day, knowing that it's a bad way to do it, there's no pride in that. There's no happiness found in work like that. No, we have to move forward. We've got to progress. We've got to take new ground. We've got to figure out ways to do things better. That's entrepreneurship. That's taking charge of your own situation, but that's exactly what CRT critiques. CRT also critiques egalitarianism and its protean character, arguing that it's often weaponized to do the opposite of what it promises. They don't want egalitarianism. They don't want everybody on equal ground. They want equal outcomes. They want equity. So the point there is, it doesn't matter whether you've worked your whole life, whether you haven't, whether you've fought for what you have or whether you've not. They want to make sure that everybody has the same thing at the end. But again, that so devalues work, you're going to have a hard time keeping people working. So what ends up happening? Well, people won't work because they are told to, they'll work because they have to. In other words, they'll work at gunpoint. They'll work because the government's forcing them to. Number 12, CRT puts forth the notion of interlocking systems of oppression, which contends the various social categories such as black, female, gay, differently abled, marked by oppression are interdependent and serve to reinforce, complement, and even complicate one another. No system of all oppression can be individually overturned without overturning them all. This is a pivotal point. For those who say that critical race theory is simply about race, that is incorrect. If you've ever wondered why BLM movement, when you went through their website initially, they tore this down not super quickly, but they did take it down, why they argued for Black lives, but that was almost a minor point on their website. They wanted people to be, essentially prostitutes and drug dealers to be freed from prison. They wanted things like, essentially family unit. They wanted family unit destroyed. They wanted church completely gone. Their thing was they wanted to overthrow all of the institutions. And that's because they see all institutions fundamentally as being corrupt and as being racist, and they want to overthrow all of them. There is no part and parcel. This is the whole thing. They want to destroy civilization. That's ultimately what this is. And this is why when you talk to people who support these things, and they don't understand that, and they think it's just about one thing or another because that's what they've heard, and they get very vocal about it because they've essentially gotten used to that type of lack of critical thinking, you get millions and millions and millions of people supporting things they do not know or they do not understand. Number 13, CRT contends that whiteness is property. CRT claims that being white in and of itself yields substantial cultural capital in the form of privileges, benefits, and resources. In other words, because you're born with a certain skin color, you simply get more. That's very hard to prove, even if those types of differences do exist. I would say things like, for example, some of the Ivy League schools not hiring a single white person, I think it was like in the last 10 to 15 years, would seem to go against that. That there's such an antagonism now toward white people that I think the opposite of that, if anything, is probably true. CRT problematizes certain, but not all, hegemonic dominant understandings of objectivity and neutrality relative to accepted knowledge and knowledge production, asserting they are often served to reify white supremacy and status quo. Yeah, essentially, they hate objectivity and they hate neutrality. They believe that when you try to lean on ration and reason and objective truth, when you try to lean on things being neutral, you're essentially being racist. So again, they don't want equality. They want equity, and if anything, they actually want dominance. They want to flip the scales. They want to become the dominant group. And finally, CRT is oppositional in nature and is consequently an emancipatory enterprise. That is, it's praxis-centric in its absolute commitment to the alleviation of racial suppression and injustice, as well as other adjacent marginalizations. There is no such thing as a CRT believer that isn't also an activist. This is how they've gotten so many people to go out to all of these protests and all of this stuff. It's because part and built into their fabric of their theory is you must be an activist. You have to go out and essentially make a fit, throw a riot, do whatever you can to disrupt society so that people give you what they want. Because in society, we tend to be polite. We tend to treat people well. And so even when people mistreat us, we tend not to mistreat them back. In fact, unfortunately, people often tend to just give them what they want so they go away, which is what's been happening until now. Now, all of a sudden, with different governmental shifts and things are shifting and people aren't just being appeased. So people are getting more and more violent, more and more antagonistic. So those are essentially some of the core things with critical race theory. Now, critical race theory arguably can be boiled down to 4 central ideas. The first one is that racism is endemic, normal, permanent, and pervasive. And again, this is probably the most fundamental or foundational idea. They argue that racism is the normal thing that occurs every day. It's the experience of most people in the country. The problem with this understanding is then you indoctrinate people into thinking everything is racist, and so then they are the victim. They feel, they perceive it. Okay, because that's how they view the world now. You know, this rejects that racism is a deviation from what would be fair or just. And it says, no, that's just the standard. And so how do they promote this idea? And this is where it gets interesting. A common slogan among supporters of critical race theory is that racism simply never goes away. It just adapts. So in other words, if you tell people, oh, white people are always going to, in general, as a society, they're always going to, if they're caught doing racism on one thing, they're just going to shift it to something else. Right? That's a very negative and pessimistic view of society, but that's what they teach. Second, it restricts a strictly traditional definition of racism that rests on individual racial prejudice or explicitly discriminatory laws. So you can make any, I mean, literally, they're saying things are racist that just aren't. And so then they say, oh, racism's endemic because we've redefined it to include these things that just actually aren't racist at all. But we're including that now. The second main idea is that racism is concealed beneath ideas like colorblindness, meritocracy, individualism, neutrality, and objectivity. Again, they view those things as ways to keep racism going, so they're going to question everything. They're going to question Enlightenment rationalism, neutral principles of the constitutional law. They don't like the Constitution. They argue that, again, neutrality and objectivity are fictions. They aren't real things. The third main tenet, the third main idea is that lived experience is critical to understanding racism. And so they're going to utilize these counter-narratives to break people's understanding and get them on their side. They're going to flip people with emotions. So they're going to tell these stories. They're going to frame them. And again, this whole thing. You know, you look at all of the BLM movement deaths that occurred. And they were always framed as murders and racist murders and evil police and all of these things. And then you look at the actual evidence, and that wasn't the case. But that doesn't matter because they keep telling the story and people just start believing it. They understand the power of media. They understand the power of media. They understand the power of repetition. And they're simply better at it than everybody else because everybody else wants to live in a civilized society, but they don't. The fourth is that racism is one of many interlocking systems of oppression. Crenshaw in 89-91 coined the term intersectionality. And essentially this is where, in critical race theory, gender, class, immigration status, surname, phenotype, accent, sexuality, it's all CRT now. Quote, critical race theory's insistence that one cannot separate CRT's analysis of racism from sexism, heterosexism, classism, and other forms of oppression is especially important when trying to assess the question of whether Christianity and critical race theory are compatible. The problem is critical race theory goes beyond race, by definition. It goes into sexuality. It goes into morality. And it's going to argue against a biblical morality in every single one of those cases. The authors also said this, quote, both Christians and non-Christians insist that CRT is a neutral analytic tool that merely examines the relationship between race and law. Such a statement signals a significant lack of understanding as to what critical race theory actually is. A commitment to the sum and substance of CRT necessarily involves subscription to progressive cultural positions regarding gender and sexuality. The field itself disallows any compartmentalization, and critical race scholars in the main reject the idea that such a compartmentalization is possible. In other words, it's trans rights, it's ultra-feminism, it's homosexuality, it's all of the stuff. You have to take it all if you're going to go CRT. Okay, they certainly won't let you stay in their group if you don't. And so again, when we look at this aspect of intersectionality, which is so core to critical race theory, it's anti-essentialist. Again, it's going to argue that everything about a person is defined in relationship to other people in a context. And thus, it's all standpoint epistemology. It's all the idea that you and you alone, because of your circumstances, can understand and have knowledge about your specific situation and how you relate to the world. And whatever you believe is simply true. Okay, again, this is the idea that our social location affects how we know and what we can know. So, another final question here is, do critics of CRT misidentify it? Well, yes and no. Some people make it too simplistic. I argue that most people who talk about critical race theory don't make it detrimental enough. This is seriously one of the worst, most vile, evil, satanic theories ever crafted by mankind. I would not be surprised if CRT is a core of the Antichrist kingdom in the end times. It's broad, it's systemic, it's everywhere, and we have to resist it at all possible levels. And so these are just some of the reasons for that. And so I hope you guys enjoyed tonight. If there's any questions, feel free, put them in the chat. I'll go ahead and answer those. Again, I ask people simply be polite, and then I will take questions from either side. I have no problem engaging with both sides on these issues, and I would love to if there are people here. So feel free if you want to post a question. Tonight, normally I do a Zoom call. Unfortunately, I have had some sleep issues, and so I did not get a lot of sleep last night. So that's another reason why I did this an hour early. So I'm actually going to call it tonight just because I'm not feeling well. I'm just overly tired. But I'll see if there's any comments before we close it up. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us here at Spirit of Truth Church for this talk on critical race theory and examination of critical theory and its central tenets. I hope you guys had a wonderful evening, and I look forward to seeing you again. We're going to be doing these talks again every Thursday, typically at 7. Although tonight was kind of an odd one out. So hope you guys have a great night, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.